if you were summarising what's happened to consultation over this book starts really in the 1980s, doesn't it? I mean, you touch on the end of the 70s and try to narrate English education through to the current day. What would either of your thoughts be? Who would like to start?
Well, I'll have a go, if you like, very quickly. Mick's had a lot of experience of that, and I'm sure he'll talk about his curriculum experience with it. But mine would be to say, I think consultation potentially could improve because of social media and all the other means that we now have to give our views, and the adoption of things like citizens' juries and extensive communication and revolution in communication. It could be like that, but it has been kind of slowed or brought into slight disrepute because over the period of our book, which is mainly since 1976, so we do hark right back to 1945, and please don't be put off because it's mostly about the present. But during that period, consultation has suffered because more and more decisions are taken at the centre by secretaries of state. So there's a wonderful quotation from a woman in Sweden, not in the book, but where she said to me once, she ran a small urban area which had its own electricity, its own water, etc., etc. And I said, this must be amazing. She said, well, a sense of powerlessness is the enemy of democracy. And I thought that's a really good saying until I read a book very recently, which was called Hatred of Democracy, which was pointing out that although we think we live in a democracy, it is in fact an oligarchy of different sorts. And since England is a huge country of 47 million. Since the war, the powers of the Secretary of State have increased from 3 to well over 2,000. And the first 3 were removal of air raid shelters, securing a sufficient supply of suitably qualified teachers, which I think ought to be decided at the centre. But Michael Gove gave up that power while taking a whole lot of others. And finally, controlling the school building programs and the opening and closure of schools. Now they control virtually everything from the centre, the money, the curriculum, the assessment, etc. And that gets in the way of meaningful consultation, because what it really means to say is we've decided what we're going to do. We'll have a period of consultation, usually over the summer holidays, and it won't make any difference anyway to whatever it is we want to do, other than the views of what this book, and anybody who wants to read it, it's by a guy called Jacques Rancière. He's a French philosopher, it's in translation. He would say, we all live in oligarchies of one sort or another, and we certainly do. And the oligarchy for education is a very, very small group of people who get the ear of the Secretary of State.
Mick, do you want to add anything to that? Because I think that summarises the view expressed in the book, and I want to challenge it. Would you like me to challenge it first, and then you...
Well, I'd perhaps add a little bit. I would say that there are lots of words used these days in terms of the organisation and management of the schooling system. Words like accountability, words like autonomy, words like consultation, but often they're paid lip service to as they move into action. The best sort of consultation is that one where people work together to construct something, often called co-construction, where you involve professionals in really thinking about the way they take their own profession forward, and they contribute to a national effort. And that's a sort of consultation work in the other way, where the energy from the system is carrying the system along. So if you want to look for a moment at what's going on in Wales, where they've really set about thinking through reform of the education system, you'll see that they've tried to link the developments in curriculum with some clear purposes, and from those purposes move into, so what do we need to do, teaching profession? to make these purposes come alive through the curriculum, well taught, well assessed, to enable all our children to be the sorts of people we want them to be as they grow up. And I think what's happened over time, as Tim was just saying, is that consultation has become a byword, an easy phrase to use, but actually it means very little in the context of the way in which education and schooling is managed these days from the centre.
So if I reflect back what you just said, you have described a shift from local authorities to the centre, which has reduced the level of co-production and genuine engagement. And also just a sense that in the centre things aren't really consulted, they're decided and rolled out. Now, I want to challenge that a bit because
Can I come in, Rebecca, and say it isn't merely the local authority that's lost its power. We wouldn't be too worried about that, even though we worked in local authorities. It's the schools, the teachers and the heads who have lost.
Thank you. So as I came through education, I got involved in consultations from the very beginning. And as a maths educator, I found myself in a community of professionals, experts in maths education, that I deeply respected. There were people who understood every genre of maths teaching, who were connected into the decisions that were being made about it. And who, when there was change going on, there were consultations where there was full engagement and people explained the thinking and they took questions and you could see the influence in practice. And that carried through, I would say, for a long time. I remember the Peter Williams review of primary maths teaching, I think it was, and meeting him and talking about that with him, which I could do just as a young teacher. We were invited, there were sessions, and I went to, there's an advisory committee on maths education, I went to their conferences and was involved in workshops where there was co-production going on. Now, you've just described a steady decline, like people walking down the stairs, but I'm thinking more of, do you know the Morecambe and Wise sketch where they're walking down the stairs with Penelope Keith in full dress? Do you remember what happened in that sketch?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, the stairway just ended and the whole thing collapsed. And that's what happened in 2010. From my perspective, because I was passionate about consultation, I was always there, and it was suddenly abolished. And then the government were taken to court for not consulting. And consultations were reinstated, but when you went to them, there was no connection between what was going on in the consultation and what was going to happen in policy, and that was known. I remember sitting in the front row and just crying. And there was no point in doing anything else. There was no point in going, and everyone knew that. And so, you know, we got in maths, we got a new primary curriculum that was completely mad. It teaches everything much younger than anywhere else in the world. I remember going to the 2012 ACME conference where Nick Gibb was explaining what he was going to do, pivoting. He'd seen some research on long division, which said that children who did better at long division at primary school did better at exams at age 16. And we were just sitting there, with about 200 of us there, we were just sitting there muttering, yeah, well, there are common causes of both outcomes. He doesn't see it, does he? And the person next to me just said no, and anyone who says that to him is being abolished. And they got rid of all the university lecturers who could contribute to the discussion, all the people who had oversight of many different types of schooling, many different types of maths teaching and the context in which different ones worked. They were all disposed of. I was working for the NCETM at the time. Do you know the NCETM? I was the lead author on their first website for teaching assistants in maths classrooms. And I was sacked without warning. And my appeal was heard in private without me being allowed to know it was even going on. And that decision was upheld. And you see, I don't think you guys really saw this because the bulk of it happened in the social media world, the technology world. You mentioned, Tim, how social media creates new ways of engaging and discussing and consulting. But what was happening, which was I was involved in the NCETM in the early days, hosting the discussion forums where there was incredible discussions going on about maths education, very wise discussions where we were all becoming aware of things we didn't previously understand. That ended immediately. And it was very, I said, what do I do now? Because my posts were being deleted on the NCETM forums. And it was very clear that the only bit about education Michael Gove was reading was Twitter and social media. There was no connection between him and people who understood education, none at all. It was a connection between his mates, who he saw face to face, who didn't understand education either, and social media. So I went on to the forums and people warned me not to because they said, beware of what will happen if you do. And immediately I was absolutely avalanched with fake social media accounts in large volumes who just posted lies about me and were communicating through messaging systems. And all the organizations I was associated with were avalanched with complaints about me that weren't real. And that's what happened to anybody who tried to continue to create consultation, or anybody who spoke up about the reality of what was going on. So there was no steady decline. This was a total drop-off, and there has been none since. I mean, we've got a new exam going live this summer. It's becoming statutory this summer, the multiplication tables check for year 4. This is another vision of Mick Gibb, his passion that age doesn't matter. So we'll be giving this exam to 8-year-olds, and it's failure that drives success. So any child who doesn't answer every single question in 6 seconds with a guillotine, every single one of them correctly will fail. To force rote learning, which is another of his passions. And it's going live. It was never consulted. There's nobody who understands maths education who supports it at all in the form it's in. People wouldn't mind a multiplication tables tracking encouragement test that was actually fit for purpose or relevant to children, but this isn't. And I've been watching the teams that I work with have been watching for this to come to Parliament, to become statutory, because it's a new statutory exam, has to go through Parliament. And suddenly it's gone on the DFE website that it's already statutory, and we're just going, how? How did we not get to debate this in the Commons? And he's used some device which is for like tiny amendments to previous legislation to put through a new exam to schools that nobody agrees with, nobody wants, is totally toxic, will just do huge damage.
Well, okay. I mean, I accept almost all the points you're making. Indeed, the sort of falling off a cliff since 2010. But in our book, we've tried to write something that will unite people rather than including people to the right as well as the left. And that's been our attempt. And I think that in her comments on it, Fiona Miller in The Guardian kind of hinted at that. Yeah. That's what we were trying to do, and we were trying to do it. I mean, I'll probably come out of my corner, so will Mick, because Gibb has gone a bit further in the Telegraph this week, as I was implying, in which he says he actually does advance the proposition. I've never seen a minister do it before, where he says it is safer for children and teachers that ministers should decide what is taught and how it is taught. So my letter, which I hope will get published in the Telegraph, implies that what a good job he wasn't a junior health minister, because he would have told us how to operate on the heart and the brain. So I think there is a particular with him, which is very unusual in our experience, that somebody has been a minister for so long. Indeed, they're not there for very long usually, and he's fallen into the habit and extended the habit of, my point, the secretaries of state have now got so much power, they're not accountable in the way they should be.
I'll also come back and say, in the book, we do draw attention to some examples of that, not perhaps as extremely as you described it. But for example, the proposed changes to teacher education and training, and the way in which the so-called golden thread is being structured and managed through the system, which I think many of the people in the teacher education world were relatively unaware of as it came in. There's been a sort of rise up against it once people realised what was proposed. But that again is an example of the increased centralisation, where ministers take it upon themselves to decide what's going to happen with a group of people that they trust, who they invest in many ways in, and ask them to take it forward without really thinking of the impact that the rest of the profession could make, or the rest of the profession could bring to it, because actually they want to reduce the impact of the rest of the profession because they know they're right. One of the things we talk about in the book is the way, you know, that some communities become very certain. They're very, very convinced that their way is the way, whereas we believe that there is a constant debate and a constant consideration of research and understanding that needs to grow. So it's a difficult area, but it has got incredibly, as you say, incredibly centralised over the last little while, and very, very personalised. One of the things we also mention in the book is the way many arguments politically now are polarised. People prefer to polarise the argument rather than listen to the nuance of it. So you're either in this group or out of this group. This isn't just in education. This is many aspects of central government. But if you're not in this group, you're not worth listening to. And if you're in this group, then you're one of the chosen few. And we know the way. And we think this is a dangerous development. And it's cleverly masked by using phrases like autonomy, and that people seem to go along with, thinking that
they were liberating teachers from
we want to make
autonomy.
We want to make the point, I think, Rebecca, about you made it at the beginning about devolution, delegation, and decentralisation. This government is not good at devolution within England, and our book is about English schools. It's very different proposition in Wales and Scotland, and even Northern Ireland. I say even Northern Ireland because it's got particular problems, but there is no sense of devolution in England. Academies and multi-academy trusts all have a direct contract with the Secretary of State, who may vary it at his pleasure or her pleasure at any moment.
So I came through always with a passion for policy development and consultations and so on. And from 2010, the option disappeared. So I've been working in health over a lot of the last 10 years as a county councillor, sorting out health issues. And we have rebuilt consultation. I've written a book about co-production of health services for the modern era, using everything we now have in terms of technology. And I've seen that in action in the health service, which has been wonderful. But for me, it's also just juxtaposed education, where there's none of it, no will for it. And we worked really hard. I was involved in the coalition just to have reasonable conversations about education and positively influence people through all the networks in the Lords and in the Commons, all the way. And we achieved some things. And of course, Michael Gove, Nick Gibb and co were removed at that time. And there was that culture of influence and shared values, which we used, but it just ended in 2015. And there was a programme on last night about where Nick Gibb and David Laws and all the people involved in the financial crash were talking about it. And they were just clear that the government knew their vote, and they were playing to that vote. They had no interest in playing to groups of who were not their voters, like people who worked in education, which is quite scary.
Well, it's a bit bothering, Rebecca, that you say this all started in 2010, and yet you say the coalition, it was all right for a few years.
No, I'm not saying it was all right. I'm saying we were watching a car crash in action, and we were able to do various things to rein that in a little bit, because at that stage, there was that conversation going on a very active scale, where lots of people who knew what they were talking about were communicating with other people in Westminster. And we did things like we stopped the grading of teachers, we got pupil premium in, set up the Chartered College of Teaching, just through conversation, the desperate need for it. Because to have consultation, you don't just need systems of consultation, you need experts who understand the variety of practice. Without those people, you can't.
One of the proposals in our book is for a schooling framework commission, and it's precisely for the reasons you're suggesting, that we propose that as a way forward. Tim, do you want to talk about how that would work for a bit?
Well, I think Rebecca's read about it and she's about to object to it, so I'll let her have a go. Okay. Come on.
No, I'm not fluent enough on the particular proposals. So can you explain them again, Tim?
Well, it's only really trying to meet the point that at the moment something ought to rein in the Secretary of State's powers, irrespective of which political party is in power. And we suggest that there should be a standing framework commission, which would meet regularly, but it would every 10 years or so, in a mid-term of a parliament, it would produce a 10-year plan for the direction in which education ought to go. And it would be a statutory requirement that any Secretary of State in introducing any action would demonstrate how they differed from this report. Now we're suggesting that, you know, obviously teacher unions, churches, faith groups, local government, CBI, universities, everybody would be involved in the standing framework commission or have a representation on it. It would still be a little bit of an oligarchy, everything is in the end, but it would be more representative, and it would produce a kind of plan. We suggest, for instance, that the chair of the select committee could be, because mostly they are independent, even if they belong to a party, would chair it, and then every so often they would give an annual report, which will go to the select committee as well as to the Secretary of State on where they thought the direction of schooling was going, commenting on actions taken over the year, etc. So that will be the aim of that, to have a restraint on the power of the Secretary of State.
And what we'd require would be a response from the Secretary of State to argue for the developments being taken, or to reject some of the proposals that the Schooling Framework Commission would put forward. So what you do is you create debate where currently, as you say, it's restricted. If we got that framework right, those people on the commission would be looking outside the commission to involve yet more people in consultation and deliberation about where we're trying to go.
Yeah, I had no objections to that, so that's why.
Oh, that's good then.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right.
And I think that'd be a lovely time to bring this bit about consultation, this little section, to a close and start a new section about Ofsted, because I think that's linked into reining in the powers of the Secretary of State as well. So are you happy to switch over to that topic?
Yes, go on.
Okay.